Hello, my name is Ralph Maltese, and this presentation is basically about project-based learning. The first thing I want to look at about project-based learning is that it's not something new. Uh, we tend to do that. We tend to find things that work well in teaching and create a whole name for them, and then divvy it up into digitized parts and say, presto, wow, this just came about. In the early 70s, I simply realized that what I was doing the conventional way, running lectures or running class discussions, which essentially meant having a discussion in class with about 5 students, just wasn't cutting it for me. My students weren't engaged, and they didn't seem to learn a great deal. I did realize that if I gave them a problem and broke them into groups to solve the problem, that they seemed to learn more. There was a lot for me to learn, of course. I had to learn about how to structure collaborative learning, and I had to learn some fundamental concepts involving good teaching. But it was just good teaching. It wasn't some trendy kind of thing. I think there are requirements, though, for project-based learning to take place. The first one is to redefine the role of the teacher. We have to change the metaphor for the teacher for project-based learning to take place. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. If we still operate under the old assembly line model, we're going to be in trouble. One of the real important aspects of project-based learning is we have to create an engaging problem, an engaging question. And we have to develop collaborative skills. We can't take for granted that students already have these skills in place. They have to be taught. So let's look at metaphors. I know I'm an English teacher and I have a weakness for metaphors, but I think metaphors are very, very important because metaphors shape our perceptions and our perceptions shape our behavior. And when nations go to war, one of the first things they do is to demonize the enemy and to make up metaphors for the enemy, whether it's the yellow devils, okay, or it's the Yankee devils, or it's the terrorists or whatever. But we objectify the enemy and we give them a good metaphor for our people to go to war against them with. For example, I can make the following observations to show you how metaphors work. The blonde bombshell walked into my party. The college professor walked into my party. The technology guru walked into my party. The award-winning chef walked into my party. Of course, the blonde bombshell, the college professor, the technology guru, and the award-winning chef could all be the same person. Another example. We're in a diner. The local bookie just arrived. Here's my mark. Who's the hunk? And the waitress says, here comes the BLT. The metaphors we use to describe ourselves as teachers and to describe our students as students is extremely important. Are we teachers simply assembly line workers, stuffing students with information which they soon forget? I think that's the current metaphor used for teachers, for educators, and that's really hurting us. It's very damaging. So I think we have to change the metaphor first. I like to look at this as not information dispensers, but we're creators. We create engaging lessons and projects that enable students to manipulate the information to solve problems. That's my metaphor for a teacher, a creator. How do we get to be this way? Well, it's the factory model metaphor. There was a good book that I really enjoyed. It was Smart Schools, Smart Kids by Edward Fisk. And he describes the factory model of American schools. And the origin of this factory model really goes back to the 40s, during World War II. We can mass produce tanks and planes and ships. So why couldn't we mass produce students? Put them on an assembly line and let them go their way. Of course, the problem with this is that the assembly line metaphor didn't expect a great deal from the students. After all, how much did they need to know? Most of them were going to work in a factory. A few students were going to be the managers of the factory, and they had to learn a little bit more. And a very tiny percentage of students would actually be the owners of the factories, and they're the ones that have to learn a lot, or let's say more than the other two. In our day, right now, about 65% of our students go to college. Back then, it was 10%. We have this olive stuffing model. Okay? We're dispensing information. The kids are on that assembly line, and they go from math class, being stuffed with so many pounds of math information, to English class, being stuffed with so many pounds of English information, the science class, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you know what? That information dispenser model is dangerous for us because people don't consider assembly line workers to be professionals. How are we going to get the respect of the policymakers as well as the communities if we continue along with that model? Today, just to give you an example of how that metaphor is still stuck in our brains and is damaging, look at online learning. Now, you and I, as educators, look at online learning and say, here are the possibilities. Suppose a kid can't get to school physically. Well, online learning is great. Suppose a student wants to take a course in Mandarin Chinese and the school doesn't offer it. He can go online and get it from some other teacher in another part of Pennsylvania. Yes, there are great values to looking at online learning as a possibility. But I can guarantee you that many policymakers and the community, I suppose, view the factory model as the key to the online learning. For example, wow, wouldn't it be great to have one teacher in a classroom sitting, in front of a computer, lecturing to 500 kids at the same time, giving out the same information to 500 people simultaneously. That's the factory model. We need, as educators, to ask essential questions of ourselves. When pressed, most teachers agree that the content is secondary to helping students create and develop skills. The metaphor of the factory model school and teachers as what I call olive stuffers, stuffing the information, shapes our teaching of skills in a linear way. For example, how many schools would approach the following problem? Imagine that standardized tests demanded that all students learn how to ride a bike. Okay? The skill of bicycle riding. Here's how we would do it in conventional schools. The English department would have the students read books about bicycles, especially classics. The social studies department would have their students study events involving bicycling. The math department would have the students measure the circumference of the bicycle tire and how many rotations it would need to go so many miles. The science department would ask students to calculate if a bicycle coming from the east at 40 miles an hour meets a bicycle coming from the west at 30 miles an hour, what would be the resulting impact? The health ed department, shows scary movies about bicycle crashes and emphasizes bicycle safety. After a week of teaching the skill of bicycling, all departments move on to the next skill, shoelace tying. The English department, On the final examination, all departments are required to have multiple choice questions of bicycling. And then we rub our hands. We taught bicycling, but we never get a kid on a bike and have him ride. When I was doing my graduate school work, one of our friends was getting her master's in piano. And they wanted to see if she could play the piano well. They didn't give her a pencil and paper test. They dragged her on stage and had her play the piano. Using essential questions, which is at the heart of problem-based learning, finding the right questions, requires that we ask questions of ourselves before we can ask questions of our students. For example, how do we form curriculum? We all easily contribute to the shopping cart curriculum. Everyone can contribute to the shopping cart curriculum, and they do. Teachers, non-teachers, butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers, school board members, Tibetan monks, all add stuff to the shopping cart. This is what I think students should learn, particularly in the area of information. Math facts, history facts, and so on. Read the first and second chapters of the novel Hard Times by Charles Dickens. All the teacher wants to teach his students is facts. Facts, facts, and more facts. We are not too far removed from the mindset of that teacher, Mr. McChokenchild. Unfortunately, we do the same procedure with skills, as if skills were content. Filling up the shopping cart when we talk about skills. Capable of being committed to memory in one day. Have you seen the literary standards lately? Have you seen the SAS skill assessments? They list hundreds of skills, all of which the student's supposed to learn in a particular year. It doesn't work that way. We know as teachers that students only learn a few skills and they learn them over a period of time. Less in this case is definitely more, because the other way it's just slipshod. We stuff the cart in the same way we hope to stuff the kids. In language arts, for example, which I know from my personal experience, we try to fit all the skills associated with writing a term paper in a couple of weeks. We focus on information gathering, which, let's face it, is cheap in the contemporary era. We have students downloading whole libraries at the click of a mouse, instead of the skills which cannot be developed in a one-shot deal. We ask students to come up with boring answers when academia is really thrilled by questions. In academia, we want to know why, if the universe is expanding or contracting. We want to know, was Shakespeare really the author of his plays? We're interested by the questions, but we are, overly concerned, I think, in high school with stuffing the kids with answers. We create myths about why we teach what we teach. Well, we're doing this because the students need this for college. And that's not always true. For example, my own children attended first-tier colleges. I asked the admission directors and many professors this question: how important is it that my child knows how to write a term paper by the time she enters college? The answer invariably was, it is not nearly as important that students know how to write a term paper as it is that they have developed the skills necessary to write a term paper. That's a big difference. Term papers demand a variety of skills, and often, in my opinion, they begin the wrong way. The academic world is much more motivated by questions than by answers. What would happen at the edge of a black hole is far more intriguing and investigative than knowing the exact distance from the Earth to the Sun. Asking what would have happened to the world if JFK had lived is much more interesting than the fact that he was shot in Dallas, Texas. We often ask students in term papers to begin with answers rather than beginning with questions. Come up with a thesis. Well, the thesis should be the answer to a good question. You should teach them how to get the questions first. I was reading a book about the bubonic plague, for example, the Black Death in the 14th century. An English bride was traveling to Spain to marry a Spanish prince, and the marriage was arranged in order that England and Spain will be military allies rather than adversaries. While stopping for a night in a castle in France, the princess contracted the plague and died. The proposed alliance was dissolved, and the question arises because of the bubonic plague: how much of the course of human history was changed by the deaths of people who could have changed the world? Would there have been a Spanish Armada if the alliance between England and Spain had endured? You can practically pick out famous people from that time period that died because of the plague and ask students to investigate each one separately. What would have happened if that person had lived? I think that's an investigative question. There's a big difference between answers and questions. I think it becomes a sticky wicket when we pontificate that here is the information that these students need to know in order to live healthy and happy lives and serve as good citizens of the earth. To me, that thinking smacks of academic tyranny. Thousands of people in Tibet have not read Hamlet, and they seem to get along just fine as a culture. The medieval Western world went about its daily business despite the misconception of a geocentric universe. We also tend to teach the way we were taught, often forgetting some things about the way we were taught. The truth is, many of us were bored at that time. If we were good students, we tend to forget that. We need to ask essential questions about our own teaching. And if you are excited about high school and were joyous through the whole experience, you have to ask yourself the question, does that mean all students learn that way? Does that mean all students would find lectures to be fun? Teachers know that people only learn a few skills, and they learn them over a period of time. Consider the number of state standards and substandards. They do not learn dribbling a basketball on Monday, rebounding a basketball on Tuesday, shooting a basketball on Wednesday, and moving on to hitting a baseball on Thursday. Any coach will tell you they practice all those skills every single day. But to do that, we'd have to realize that developing skills takes practice, and practice takes time. And then if we do that, to use the time appropriately to learn those skills, we can't do all the 500 other thousand skills we want them to learn, or the 600 pounds of content we want them to digest. Look at how it shapes our everyday teaching. Okay, I want you to learn how to climb a tree, but we're not going to actually climb a tree. I'm just going to lecture to you about climbing a tree. And can we actually climb a tree, sir? No. Don't have the time. Likewise, students do not learn paraphrasing on Monday, analysis on Tuesday, synthesis on Wednesday, and move on to classifying on Thursday. We have to start with visions and goals. But you know what? It's relatively easy to come up with great goals. What the educator does, or can do, that the layperson cannot do, whether the layperson's on the school board or anywhere else, is that once we develop the goals, we can face the real challenge to develop operational goals. Otherwise, if we don't do that, we fall into what I call the Miss America pageant interview. When I was growing up, we always watched the Miss America pageant, and at the end, near the end of the whole performance, the finalists were asked this was the intellectual part, right? They were asked a certain question and asked to answer it. And it was usually some question kind of like this. If you were selected as Miss America, what would be a personal goal of yours? And the answer would be something like, well, if I were picked as Miss America, my first goal would be world peace. And as a follow-up question, how would you achieve world peace? I believe that in order to achieve world peace, people should love each other and take care of each other. And if they do, we will have world peace, which means people will love each other and take care of each other. Well, you know what? That goal is just wonderful, but it's not really investigatable or forensic. It's unrealizable unless we break down the goal, the essential question, into operational goals. We can achieve world peace by removing trade tariffs to third world nations, providing the poorest countries with access to the internet, etc. We develop Miss America goals without even realizing it. For example, what does it mean to promise that every child has a laptop on his desk? It means nothing to me. The essential question was the operational goals within it. Developing good essential questions means avoiding the Miss America pageant interview. I want students to appreciate literature. What does that mean? I don't know what that means. In most cases, it means that when a student graduates, he appreciates the fact that he will never have to read esoteric literature again. We need to create operational goals. Or another way to look at it, we need to create workable essential questions. We create engaging problems, questions for the students to investigate and answer for themselves. The trick here is to create an engaging problem, remembering that the content is a gateway to developing the skills. This is harder than it sounds. It's hard to get people to understand, to think about the fact that I don't really care about the students walking away knowing so much about Edgar Allan Poe. I'll use the stories of Poe to help the students develop higher level thinking skills. That's what it's really all about. And to be honest, if I were teaching science or math or social studies, I would have exactly the same goals. Those thinking skills, synthesis, analysis, making connections. And I would use the content as a means to get to those skills, or to have students develop those skills. I have a theory of essential question building. So let's, developing a good essential question, please take out a slip of paper and answer the following questions. Name 3 cities in the United States that begin with the letter P. Because I don't want to run out of time, we'll go faster. Name the 3 states in the United States with the highest mileage of railroad track. List the 4 states whose capital cities begin with the same alphabet letter as the name of the state. For example, Harrisburg begins with an H and Pennsylvania begins with a P, so Pennsylvania is not one of those states. Which of these questions was the most engaging? I think most people will agree. And by the way, if you want the answer to question 3, that the first question was too easy. Gee, I got that in 2 seconds. The second question was too hard. How the heck am I supposed to know that? I don't know about railroads. But the third question was just right. Doable, but challenging. I can get this. I just have to run down a list of my states and try to remember the capitals. But it's doable. And that's the heart of creating a good essential question for project-based learning, by developing a good question. There are plenty of projects out there right now, but using laptops and the internet to make collages of photos of my friend in the Klan, that doesn't cut it. Or projects which simply gather data about Edgar Allan Poe's favorite cemeteries are not intellectually challenging projects. We should factor in high-level thinking skills when creating projects. Bloom's taxonomy is a good way, or the new interpretation of Bloom's taxonomy is a good way to start. Now, you'll always face, when you're trying to propose project-based learning, the old-timer who told me, dang nabbit, I want them to know the cause of the American Civil War. Fair enough. But research says that students will retain the information about the causes of the American Civil War if they use the information to solve a problem. For example, instead of just lecturing to them about the cause of the American Civil War, how about what similarities and causality do the American Civil War and the sectarian war in Iraq have in common? Students would have to do the work. They would have to research and learn about both conflicts in order to solve the problem. They would also have to analyze, they would have to, and synthesize, come up with an answer. Well, I think my experience has been creating a problem like this for students to solve has them learn the content better and for a longer period of time. A good essential question needs to include different ways of answering it, multiple intelligences, can be divided into operational goals, must involve real-world benefits or real-world consequences or both, includes cross-curricular investigation from one subject to another, requires students to do something. Essential questions can be topical, related to the content. In fact, when I developed my projects, they usually had both, related to the particular subject matter and also overarching, relating the content to a larger context. I'd like to give you some examples here, and I'm not going to say anything while we go through them. I'll just have you read them. Think cross-culturally. As a group, think of an essential question. What is something you want students to learn? Discuss why you want them to learn this content or skill. Of all the possible things you can give to these students for their benefit, why did you choose this one? What methodology approach would be most effective in helping the student learn what you want them to learn? This is one of the most important questions that teachers ask or should ask. And that is that, okay, given the fact this is what I want them to learn and why I want them to learn it, how do students learn these things? How do students learn these skills? They don't learn it by just a one-shot deal. Think about what you remember from high school. Usually the memory is from something you did. It's from a project you worked on with others, a report you wrote, a presentation you made, a speech you gave. One major concept of PBL, project-based learning, is that students must present something, a documentary, a multimedia event, lesson taught to elementary school children that explains the content, a product that draws on a number of different intelligences. Essential questions build from content-specific to abstract concepts. We begin with a why do mayflies live for only 2 or 3 days, to what conclusions about reproduction can we draw from studying mayflies, to will we live our lives differently if we were immortal. The questions build up from the specific, the concrete, the ones answerable by gathering information, to the general, the abstract, the ones that lead to knowledge, the ones that test students' high-level thinking activities, high-level thinking skills, from the simple right up to the terminative, what I call the terminal contemplative point, the essential question. All of us, young and old, rich and poor, face essential questions. The problem with asking essential questions, especially those involving higher level thinking skills, is that asking essential questions takes time to answer, requires students to work in ways they may not be used to, and requires that teachers have to relinquish ownership of student knowledge. This is an alien idea. We're going to get to that more about the difference between information and knowledge in just a second. Just let's please remember that not everything that is measurable is of value, and many things that are of very great value are not measurable, like love. The answers the students come up with are not always measurable. They belong not to information but to knowledge. They are personal. And what I just said to reemphasize. We have to live with the students' answers to the great essential question. Example, if a student argues effectively that if she were immortal, she would not live her life any differently, we cannot say she's wrong. PBL understands the difference between information and knowledge. Now, this was an important concept in my own teaching career, and it comes from Michael Polanyi, who's a philosopher and a physicist, who argues that, well, information is public. Information is public and not debatable. Knowledge is private and is forensic. It is debatable. Information today is Friday. Okay, today I live in the United States. Nobody's going to dispute those facts. Okay? And it's public. Everybody knows today is Friday. Everybody knows that we live in the United States. That's not disputable. But knowledge is very private. Last summer, my wife and I visited the Harry S. Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. Beside President Truman's grave was a plaque from veterans of World War II. The inscription on the plaque thanked Truman for dropping the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. Now, my father was in the Navy at that time, and like other GIs, having survived the Japanese suicide plane attacks at Okinawa, he was not really optimistic about his chances of surviving an invasion of Japan. Knowing how hard the Japanese fought at Okinawa, part of their homeland, the Americans faced the impending invasion with great trepidation. Of course, they did not have to invade Japan because the Americans dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, then a second bomb in Nagasaki 3 days later. The war was over. Now, the fact that the Americans dropped the bomb in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945 is a piece of information. It is not disputable, and it is public. Nobody argues that. However, my father's knowledge of that event is private and forensic. Certainly how my father knew that event and how the Japanese knew that event are probably very different knowledges. We're not in the information business as teachers. If we were, we'd be easily substituted by things like the internet, by things like computers. We're in the knowledge business. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we create engaging projects that involve students in high-level thinking involving the information. They use the information to develop their skills of synthesis, analysis, making connections, etc. And that's what we do as teachers. We're in the knowledge business, not the information business. An important component of just before I go on. In the conventional classroom, who does the most talking? And the same is true of thinking. In the conventional classroom, who does the most thinking? I would argue the teacher does the most thinking. We got to reverse that. The student should be doing the most thinking. An important component of project-based learning is collaborative skills. They must be learned. I've had so many teachers tell me, you know what? I brought the kids into groups and I told them, I gave them an assignment, and then I went over and I sat at my desk and marked papers. And I looked up 20 minutes later, and they were goofing around. Well, did you choose the groups? No. I let them choose their own groups. First mistake. Okay. Did you walk around and observe them and work with them? No. Second mistake. And on it goes. Here's some characteristics of collaborative learning. Students, good groups, articulate and listen. They share leadership, they develop trust, and they creatively problem solve. And on my website, in one of the essays under education, there are guidelines for collaborative learning you might want to refer to. Another hot topic today, I really don't know why, because good teachers have been doing this all along, but it's differentiated education. And you have all kinds of theories. If I had 25 people in here, 25 teachers, and asked them about differentiated education, I get 25 different perspectives. Okay? Here's mine. Some teachers argue, well, differentiated education means breaking the kids up into their breaking them up by interest within a class, such as assigning different books. And when you do that, all it simply does is it creates homogeneous grouping within the class itself, which I'm against. I'm against tracking. Okay. So now you have the little red birds and little blue birds and little yellow birds. Everybody knows who's who. The job of the teacher, secondly, is not to indulge student interests. Let's think about this in high school. What do you think most high school boys are thinking about? It's not to indulge their interests. It's to expand their interests. So I differentiate not in a front end. I differentiate by assigning different kinds of products within a project so that students can demonstrate their understanding. For example, in a project on The Great Gatsby, one of the choices was to write music for each of the characters, play the music for the class, and see if you can capture the characterization. And I had a young man who played the clarinet, and he wrote these pieces of music for each of the characters in the novel. And he gave me the list of the music he played next to the characters that they represented. But he didn't tell the class this. And he sat down and played the clarinet, a piece, and he'd ask the class, which character do you think that is? And they would say, oh, that's Daisy. And I'd look at the card, and they'd be right. He'd play another piece of music. Ah, that's Nick. And I'd look at the card, and that'd be right. Now, did that student demonstrate his understanding of characterization in the novel? I think so. So I differentiate on the back end. When the students actually have to produce something, they can demonstrate their understanding in different ways. Project-based learning requires a new metaphor for the role of teacher, from olive stuffer to creator. The development of engaging and challenging questions, an understanding of the difference between content and skills, and the difference between information and knowledge, and the understanding that we have to teach collaborative skills. You can expect rebellion. A teacher came to me and asked me to work with a project with him on Edgar Allan Poe. For the first semester, he performed the conventional way. Had class discussions, again, involving 5 or 6 kids, lectured, and this time he assigned a project. The students rebelled. This was the first time they really had to work. They had to think. They couldn't just sit back and hide in a class of 30. Thank you for taking the time to watch this. I hope you found it useful.